Hi everyone, I'm Suzanne Clemens, one of the pastors at Trinity United Methodist Church in Lafayette, Indiana. And this week at Trinity, we're concluding a 3-week series leading up to Thanksgiving. So 3 Sundays now where we've been focused on gratitude, on preparing our hearts to be thankful this Thanksgiving season. And recently, I've been very cognizant of a deep place of gratitude in my heart for the opportunity that I've had to take a much desired vacation recently. So some of you may know that I just returned from a 10-day trip that I was very much looking forward to. It's been the first trip actually that my husband and I, just the two of us, have taken together in all of our 25 years as a couple. And the impetus for the vacation was the invitation to officiate the wedding of Noah and Flannery, a delightful new young adult couple here at Trinity who chose to be married in the beautiful countryside outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And as I planned to bless their wedding, my husband and I decided to take a longer stay and celebrate our upcoming 25th wedding anniversary a little early. So we married in December of 98 and afterward honeymooned in the mountains of Gatlinburg. So this just felt like the perfect opportunity for us to celebrate together and take some time away. And since I was going to be so close to North Carolina, I decided to add a few days on the front end of my trip to visit my mother. And I'll tell you all, I can't remember the last time that I traveled for 10 whole days. And as I anticipated this trip, I was imagining early morning sipping coffee outside my mother's home, enjoying the extended warm fall down south, the gorgeous fall colors. I knew that the Tennessee wedding was going to be meaningful and very beautiful. And then my husband and I were going to have a few days of peace just to ourselves, to take in Nashville, Tennessee, and to do whatever we wanted kid-free for the first time. But isn't there a saying about our best laid plans? Well, in retrospect, I am still extremely grateful now for the timing of my visit with my mom, although I did end up spending almost the entirety of that first part of my trip away with her in the hospital because she had fallen and fractured a hip just a couple of days before my trip. And so the 2 days leading up to my departure were full of things like phone calls and checking in with her caregivers, with emergency department staff, the hospitalist, and her surgeon. And on the day of my 12-hour drive to North Carolina, my mom was in surgery that day, which thankfully was a success. And I was a bit frazzled heading out, as you can imagine. And about an hour into my drive, my husband called me to let me know I'd left behind my toiletries bag. So all of my makeup, toothbrush, shampoo, all of that stuff was still in Lafayette. Well, I reasoned, right? I can make do. So that night, as I drove into my hometown, I stopped by the drugstore, picked up a couple of essentials, but then I headed straight to the hospital, where I spent the next few days. And I found my mother stable, but very agitated and confused and in pain. So I was by her side day and night, right, helping her stay calm, trying to figure out the plan of care for her. Fortunately, my second night there in the hospital, I figured out how to actually recline the recliner in the room, so that was a help. I could actually get a little bit better of a night's sleep. But I remained there with her until the last minute that I needed to leave for Nashville. And then on about 5 hours of sleep, I drove 10 hours to pick up my husband from the Nashville airport and head to the wedding welcome reception. And to paint a little bit more of a picture here for you all, at that time I had not showered in about over 4 days since I'd left home. And as we pulled into the reception venue, right, I'm able to change my clothes in the car, comb my hair, apply some makeup, but then we did go in and I enjoyed the most delightful, delicious meal and wonderful company that I'd had in a really long time. Well, the next day was this wedding, and it was one of the most beautiful and inspiring and meaningful weddings I've ever attended. So after, after the, all the nerves and excitement of the wedding, I'm finally beginning to relax and breathe. And then the next day, just the exhaustion hits. I knew I'd been running on fumes. I knew the stress and lack of sleep was about to catch up with me. But really, I'm here about to celebrate time with my husband, and I am exhausted. So we decided to start the next day by taking in a peaceful hike. We found a park, and we're outside. It was beautiful, but as we were leaving the parking lot of that park to head back to our cabin, I felt a huge bump in the car, and my husband Brent immediately stopped the car. He had inadvertently hit a huge concrete block that was right there on the edge of the drive. It had taken a chunk out of the sidewall of one of our rear tires. So we had to drive home very carefully. Brent took the afternoon there to replace the damaged tire and with the spare. And so the next day of our trip, we spend our highly anticipated vacation at Discount Tire, getting new rear tires for our car. Well, from that point on, the next few days did progress as we had hoped for our trip. But I'll admit to you, there are several moments in my 10-day time away when I thought to myself, right, this is not the vacation that I had planned or imagined, right? As I navigated my mother's sensitive condition in the hospital, there was so much empathy for her fear and her pain, and really a lot of moments of anxiety and frustration when the care team there at her hospital could not discern really what was best for her moving forward. And I was aware of just this feeling of unfairness for her, and I felt helpless at times to be her advocate in the way that I wanted to be. And I didn't want to begin my anniversary trip with my husband so exhausted and depleted, but that is just how it was. I wanted to make the most of every moment. And I was tempted to feel a little cheated when we had to spend those hours in the waiting room at Discount Tire on that beautiful day in the countryside. Well, today's sermon is entitled, In Everything. And in his letter to the people in the church in Philippi, the Apostle Paul is encouraging his friends to be content and to give thanks to God in all things. Right? When life is easy and when it is hard, when we're treated well and when we aren't, when we have much and when we have little, when our plans yield the outcomes that we desire and when they don't. And a mature faith, a life that's marked by real spiritual health, well, it has this gratitude at its center, gratitude for all things. And in fact, many spiritual teachers insist that the most essential attitude in the life of Christian faith is the attitude of gratitude. When we wake up each day thankful for the day that we have been given, regardless of what the day holds for us, we are acknowledging our dependence on God and on the life force in general, and the truth that each day we have is truly an amazing gift that we cannot manufacture or earn for ourselves. An attitude of gratitude, it has a way of shaking us out of a mindset that somehow we are deserving of certain things to go a good way for us, right? That we are entitled to good experiences or outcomes, when really it is a gift just to be here. There is nothing really in the gift and grace of life that we could say that we deserve, right? Or that we earn for ourselves. Every single breath and every single day is a pure, sacred gift. Now, I also will admit to you all that it's one thing for us to think and say that, right? That life is a gift, and to mentally agree to this. And it's another thing to actually live it out. And I can't help but wonder how the Apostle Paul may have felt, right? Drafting this letter of gratitude and encouragement to the people in the church of Philippi while he was being imprisoned, right? He's writing this from prison. knowing that his very survival was in question. Right? There's certainly not anything okay or fair about this situation for Paul. Right? There's no inkling of justice in this situation for him. He has no control over his life in this moment. He doesn't know what's going to come next. And we know that Paul wasn't in prison just once during his ministry. Scholars count up to somewhere between 3 to 7 times of imprisonment for Paul over his life. And my sense is then that this situation of his must have become familiar to him, right? The profound insecurity and lack of control, the physical vulnerability of being imprisoned. And yet, Paul is speaking out from prison with encouragement for others and with a spirit of gratitude toward others. So he writes, "Do not be anxious in anything, but with gratitude in your heart, make your needs known to God, who is with you and will give you the peace and mind of Christ." So we see here, right, the situation around Paul is not okay, but Paul is okay. And I don't know about you, but I want what Paul has in this situation. I want the peace and the contentment that he has. I want to be able to be free of anxiety when I don't know what's coming next. I want to find a way like Paul's way, because he's found a way. Or perhaps more accurately, we might say that God has showed him and led him into a way of trust and mercy and forgiveness and grace to guide him in his hard place and into the future. And I think, too, it's important to notice here that Paul isn't expecting God to remove his difficulties and his suffering. He's not asking God for that. That's not what he's expecting. Instead, Paul is trusting God to be intimately with him in his difficulty and to transform his mind and his heart to withstand his difficulty and to come out with him on the other side. By what he calls putting on the mind of Christ, Paul endures and is able to live from a place of contentment and inner peace. Because of his intimacy with God, Paul here, he's not returning brutality with brutality. Paul is not returning violence with vengeance. Through trust and intimacy with the source of love himself, Paul is able to transform his pain and suffering and to be a channel of love to others, even in the midst of these very difficult circumstances. Paul is also able, as we can see through this letter, to see how God comes to him through the care and the tangible concern of his beloved church in Philippi. This is, in fact, the impetus for this letter of thanks that Paul's writing here. Because we're told, like Paul writes in this letter, he acknowledges that some weeks or months before, the church there sent a member of their community to help him. They've sent a financial love gift to Paul through him, and this individual has stayed with Paul and is able to be a helper to him, such that this person really overextended himself and became ill while he was there with Paul. So sick, in fact, that he was almost critically ill and had to leave and go back to Philippi. And Paul's moved by this compassion and generosity extended to him through this church, which has gone to sacrificial lengths to minister to Paul while he has been imprisoned. So we can learn from Paul here, right? Because we also can pay attention to the way that others bring light and life to us during our times of pain and hardship. Such encounters, well, they can mean everything, can't they? And when we're in a place of hardship, our being able to see and to be grateful for the kindness and giving of others toward us is also a way that we put on the mind of Christ. And we can gain peace and contentment in that process of being grateful for the way that others care for us. Well, Paul also has some other advice for the church in this letter. He tells them to take care in terms of what they put in their minds and what they attend to, what they put their attention toward. They're to be intentional about focusing on what is good and true and uplifting. Well, and how many of us today can use that advice? Because we're all always paying attention to something, aren't we? Whether it is conversations that we find ourselves in with others, or following social media, or watching or listening to the news, or music, or podcasts, or the groups that we belong to. I would say this attending to also includes the train of thoughts in our own heads, right? It's important for us to ask, what am I paying attention to? What am I listening to? What am I taking in? Are my encounters inviting me to put on the mind of Christ? And for me, a helpful way to assess this is for me to ask myself, right? Am I cultivating the fruits of the Spirit through the ways that I am connecting with the world, right? Am I cultivating love, joy, peace, patience, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? And if I'm not, then I need to re-examine where I'm placing my time and attention. And in our distracted day and age, with so many false sources of happiness out there trying to grab our attention, I think that we need this advice from Paul more than ever. Well, now I want us to return to our earlier examination of Paul's very difficult situation, right? As he's writing this letter, he is suffering, he's not in control. And I think it's fair to say that many of us perhaps still can't quite get our heads around how he can be so content and grateful and non-anxious under these very hard circumstances. And I get that. But I also would like to propose another perspective, one that others who have walked through unexpected, exceptionally hard situations have found to be true for themselves. We could say that there is a kind of paradox or contradiction in life whereby some of our most meaningful moments, our most meaningful changes and insights, that they can come directly through suffering and hardship. I think many of us, myself included, can think back to distinct periods of difficulty and perceive that somehow we were more vividly alive. We were more vividly open. Our hearts became softer, and we rubbed up against a sacred mercy in a way that daily, regular, old life just does not invite. And such hard moments and seasons can change us. And if we're patient with ourselves and God in such moments, they can make us more whole, more compassionate, more like the people whom God has created us to be. And last year, in a Thanksgiving meditation that she composed, a cancer survivor named Christy Nelson, she reflected on her journey with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was diagnosed around the age of 33. And she endured about 18 months of hospitalizations, surgeries, and chemotherapy. And she writes that as she was ending her treatment and was, talking with her doctor about what would come next, her doctor told her, he said, "You will never be totally out of the woods." He said, "You will only ever be okay for right now." And she said that this news was really destabilizing for her, and it put her life in a whole new perspective. And she wrote in her meditation on this time, and I'm going to quote her here at length. This is Christy sharing her story. She wrote, "The first few years of uncertainty and remission put the blessings of my life in sharp relief. I was in super soak mode. Every experience was saturated with new meaning, and I was absorbing it all fully. I didn't know any other way to live the moments I had than to greet each one as gratefully as I could. Not sure how much more time was mine, I was awestruck by every moment, every person, and everything. Being grateful those first few years was relatively easy and revelatory. I would wake up in a room bathed in light, hear birds singing, and notice that I was still breathing, that I could put both feet on the floor and walk freely to a kitchen where I could make a cup of tea. It was enough to make me start each day with tears of joy. Being alive was enough. But over time, all those amazing reasons to feel grateful joined the ranks of the taken for granted. I got healthy and busy. I began chasing goals and the fulfillment they promised. I martyred myself to a job, complained about things like traffic, my weight, and colds. I ruthlessly compared myself to others, succumbed to retail therapy and debt, and suffered from stress. Each year that passed, I built up a kind of gratitude tolerance. What used to be enough got left in the dust in the pursuit of having more. Having cheated death, I began to cheat life. Well, after some challenging years, dramatic wake-up calls, and my share of spiritual suffering, I came to realize that maintaining a grateful perspective is a true practice. This capacity for grateful perspective is a muscle I needed to build and use, and it's still something I need to nurture and tend daily. The practice of looking at the world through grateful eyes and with a grateful heart is an exquisite end in itself. Well, as I reflect on Christy Nelson's story, I can relate. And I bet some of you might be able to relate too. Living life from a place of awe and acceptance and gratitude does not come naturally. It takes some intentional practices, especially the practice of prayer. And I've also found that it's been in the times of my darkest difficulties that a spark of trust and mercy has been lit, and I've been moved to grow in love and gratitude with God. So, as we all prepare to celebrate Thanksgiving this week, may we come before God, mindful of all of the parts that make up our lives. And perhaps instead of narrowing our list of thanks to the feel-good parts of our lives that signal abundance, may we be open to being grateful for it all, for the parts that are full and empty, the parts we understand and the parts we question, the moments that are happy and the ones that are sorrowful, the parts that go as planned and the parts that don't. May we stay attuned to how God sometimes shakes us awake through the rough edges of our lives. And may we also look intentionally for what is good and true and hopeful, and allow what is pure and uplifting to shape our mindsets and our hearts. And may we come before God with open hands and in gratitude for it all. For God loves us and shapes us in it all. May we trust that God is with us in love and solidarity in everything. Thanks be to our steadfast and merciful God. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.